people, though, who are in positions of responsibility, those people who are in government, do have to come up with answers. They're probably no more confident of their answers than I am, but the thing is, they have to come up with an answer. McGeorge Bundy was one of those Harvards that Lyndon Johnson resented and distrusted. He was the national security advisor to John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson inherited him along with the presidency. And McGeorge Bundy had been dean of Harvard College. His Ivy League pedigree went way back, and he circulated with all of that Harvard crowd that Johnson distrusted. And McGeorge Bundy used to engage in, debates till late at night in the Georgetown homes of his friends in Washington. But then there would come a time when most of those friends, those friends were mostly academics, types like me, who can just debate and debate and debate. And we can pose these questions. And then Bundy would say, about the end of the evening, he'd say, well, this is all well and good, but on Monday morning, I've got to go into the office and I've got to make a decision. And this is where it gets hard. And I, as a historian, have to resist the temptation to point out the flaws in various policies of presidents that I've studied. Because it's real easy with hindsight to say, Johnson should have done that, Roosevelt should have done that, Lincoln should have done that, Jackson, you name it. But the fact is that at the time they made those decisions, they made them, I think in most cases, on the best information and intelligence they had. And I'm going to give them credit for having the best of intentions. It's easy to criticize politicians and think they're all just a venal bunch of crooks. At the very least, they're a set of rascals and they're mostly out to feather their nests. Now, in my study of history and the history of American politics, yeah, you find that. But if all you're in it for is your own self-interest, frankly, a lot of people in politics, I'm not going to say most people in politics, I hate to generalize that much, but there are a lot easier ways to make money than to go into politics. So if that's what you're in it for, go into something else. Most people who go into politics have the public interest at heart. They sometimes have peculiar interpretations of the public interest, but nonetheless, they're sincere. And they've got to make decisions. And sometimes they get them right, sometimes they get them wrong, but at least they're the ones who have to make the decisions. Other questions? Yes, over here.
I was intrigued by your discussion of Johnson's personality, especially his feelings of inferiority, and I wonder how you would compare him with Nixon. Are there similarities?
Ooh, Nixon is a remarkable character. I'm sorely tempted to do a biography of Richard Nixon. Some of you know that I'm in the process of writing a series of biographies that are supposed to cover the entire ground of American history. And I'm just finishing, in fact, I'm pleased to report that this afternoon, when I did have a little bit of time off, I finished the revisions of my Franklin Roosevelt book, and I got a report, sadly, Roosevelt died. But anyway, so I'm thinking of what's going to be the next book in the series, and I'm seriously considering Richard Nixon. Not because Richard Nixon is a particularly attractive character, but he's very intriguing, and I don't get Richard Nixon. And I think it's worth spending a while trying to figure out Richard Nixon. I am cautioned by this. Some of you have read the work of the late Stephen Ambrose, a historian who was very popular with lots of stuff. And to my money, the best book he ever wrote was his 3-volume biography of Richard Nixon. And it's a very good look at Nixon. But I knew Stephen Ambrose, and we were talking some while after he finished Volume 3. And so I said something about Richard Nixon. And Steve Ambrose, as I say, he was a wonderful guy, but he wouldn't have denied the fact that he was a sort of a hard liver. He was a hard drinker, hard smoker. He had strong opinions about everything. And I remember as soon as I uttered the word Nixon, he said, and he had, after all those years of smoking and drinking, he had this very gravelly voice. He said, "God damn Nixon! I wasted a decade of my life on that son of a bitch." Well, I don't know if I'm going to give him that much of my life, but nonetheless, he's an intriguing character, especially because he really cuts against the grain of people's perceptions of politicians. If there's one thing most politicians have in common, it's a certain pleasure that comes from being around people. They're gregarious types. They like people. They like to talk. They like to shake hands. You know, politics in a democracy is ultimately a popularity contest. And you're only going to be popular if people like you. And probably you're only going to get people to like you if you sort of like them. Richard Nixon wasn't likable, and he didn't like people. What I can't figure out is why he went into politics. I can tell you a little bit about why he succeeded in politics. He was probably almost as intelligent as Lyndon Johnson. He was exceedingly sharp. He was also, there are different kinds of intelligence, and any of you who've been around universities know that there are, call them sort of the literary intelligences, people who are good at reading and writing. And then those of you who've been in the business world, or maybe in politics or elsewhere, realize that there's another kind of intelligence. Sometimes there's an overlap between the two. Call it a practical intelligence or a social intelligence. How you understand how people think and how to get them to go along with what you want them to do. I had a chance to speak to members of the Leadership Academy at lunch today. And this is the essence of leaders. Richard Nixon could do that kind of thing, but it didn't come easily to him. So I'm thinking about writing about Richard Nixon. And while my previous biographies have often been called The Life and Times of, say, Andrew Jackson, this one is going to be called The Lives of Richard Nixon. Although I have been tempted to use this little device where you put parentheses around the V in lives. So anyway, so ask me in about 5 years, and I'll tell you what the answer to the Richard Nixon question is. Bill, did you have a question?
One last question.
Yeah, I knew where you were going from our earlier conversation, and I'm not sure whether your opening was just provocative or you really believe all of that. But one of the...
I'll never tell.
One of the ideas you advanced is that the Civil War was primarily a conflict between the East and the West. And if you really believe that, then I think you are way under appreciating how much slavery was the issue. When you look at what the South said, why they seceded, it was clearly about slavery.
You bet.
There was a president elected by a Republican Party that their central platform was the ultimate extinction of slavery, and they weren't going to allow that. Secondly, when you mentioned that if a popular referendum was held, the Northern majority would have said, go ahead and take a hike. But James McPherson, in his really seminal study about why did Union soldiers fight, overwhelmingly it was to preserve the Union, and that seems to conflict with that. And then thirdly, Lincoln would argue, and I would agree, that just because you use an election, that doesn't allow you to walk in a democracy. And if you would allow that, then no democracy would be sustained. It would be so fragile that every time somebody got elected that you didn't like, you'd secede.
Right. Now, believe it or not, I agree with everything you said. And that still doesn't exactly undermine what my thesis was. The answer to your question, the preface to your question was, yes, I was primarily trying to be provocative. I don't expect that James Buchanan will ever be considered a great president, and I don't think he deserves to be. He was the wrong man for the moment. If he had been elected 15 years earlier, he might well have been a great president. He had all the preparation to be president, and he had the temperament to be president during a different time. But I misspoke if I came off as saying that the Civil War was East against West rather than North against South. It was definitely North against South. But my point was that it was as much about the West as it was about the South. It was much, to the thinking of Northerners, including Abraham Lincoln, it was as much about the future of the South, the future of the West, as about the future of the South. Because the future of the West was the future of the Union. And when Lincoln had looked at the way American society, American culture and civilization spread across the country, it was moving from east to west. And if the Union lost control of the Mississippi, all of a sudden that would stop expansion out to the west.